Okay, so I'm going to give you an official welcome to our My Smart Garden session tonight on growing vegetables from seed. My name is Kat Labors and I actually run the My Smart Garden program out in Hobsons Bay, but I'm going to be also teaching the session tonight as well. My Smart Garden is an 8-council collaboration across metropolitan Melbourne. And this is a program that's all about helping you to be more successful at growing and using your garden space functionally, whether that's for food growing or to process wastes like compost or turning grey water into fruit, which is one of my favourite tricks. We also look at habitat gardening. We look at how to cleverly position trees and vines around your house so that your sun doesn't get as hot in summer or even as cold in winter. So we do all kinds of things and we call it smart gardening, and we're so happy that you're here with us this evening. Now, of course, I want to acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional custodians of the land in Hobsons Bay and also the waterways, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. But of course, not all of us live in Hobsons Bay, so I'd also like to invite you to take a moment to consider who has cared for the land under your feet wherever you are tonight and what ongoing challenges they might be facing. It's also good to acknowledge that we're at a point in history where we're in a climate emergency. And I want to say that all these actions that people are taking, whether they're tiny or whether they're huge, they all matter and they're all very important. And there's lots of reasons why growing food at home contributes to a safer climate. And I trust that you'll know many of those. But thank you for being here and thank you for taking whatever steps you are. Now, tonight's session is a special one because we're running it as part of Permaculture Out West's festival of events that's coming up this spring. So at this point, I'm just going to briefly hand over to Sarah Rickard from the group Permaculture Out West, and she's just going to give you a description of that festival and list a couple of the other great events that are coming up that you might like to take part in. So Sarah, can you unmute that microphone and away you go.
Yeah, thanks, Kat, and hi to everyone. It's great to see so many people joining in around Melbourne. As Kat said, I'm part of the group Permaculture Out West. We're a group based in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and we're all people who are either practicing, learning, or just have an interest in permaculture. Permaculture Out West is part of an overarching group of called Permaculture Victoria, which you can find out about more online. What we do as a group is get together and create activities and run events and workshops like these and garden tours. And our current event coming up is called Pollinate the West, which is a seed swap and community bike ride that we're doing around Bunurong at the moment. We kicked off just this week actually putting boxes into local businesses. They're hosting them and the boxes have been decorated by some of our other local groups such as Friends of Groups and neighbourhood houses and the like. And they're put on a map where you can go and find out where to go and donate seeds to in the local businesses. We're getting people then to sign up to order seeds, and we'll be getting together and working out how to distribute the seeds to individual people. And then on August the 15th, we're going to be hosting a special event that's both the community bike ride, where some bike riders will ride around Bunurong and deliver the seeds locally. And we'll also have the opportunity for people to come and collect seeds from a site in Seddon on the day and run a couple of workshops as well and just get together and possibly swap some seeds or seedlings that people might bring along on the day. Yeah, so you'll be able to find out more about this on the Facebook and Permaculture Out West website, and I'll post those links in the chat group for you. Thanks, Kat.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to make you a co-host now because Zoom is allowing me to do that again. Let me just jump back into the spotlight. Okay, so just a tiny little bit more housekeeping before we go on with the main program. You no doubt by now are all aware that keeping yourselves on mute unless you're talking is really important to make sure we have great quality audio for everyone in the session. So have a look now, just check whether your microphone is on or off, and if it is on, please mute it, or we will do that for you if we need to. I would really love to take questions as we go tonight, so I'll try and keep up with them. The best way to do that is by putting them in the chat window, and that way I can read them as they come up. But if you are on a phone or something and it's quite difficult for you to type or find the chat window, then do feel free to unmute and ask a question as we go. If it's on topic though, that's quite important. Of course, we'll have a chance to do more questions at the end of the session, and I'll also have some notes that I can share with you then as well. And just finally, I am recording right now as we speak. So just a note, if you don't want to appear in the recording, then just use that chat window. And also note that you can change the name that's appearing publicly if you want to. That's by clicking the More button next to your name in the participants window, and then you can change it to anything that you like. And I can also see that Sarah and also the wonderful Michelle from Permaculture out west are putting up some links to Facebook and other websites in the chat window for you. So definitely check out their festival that's happening in the next few weeks. All right, so let's get into the main part of today's session, which of course is on growing veggies from seed. And this session has been thought about as just the introduction that you need to get growing, have success as we're coming into spring. And it is particularly focused on vegetables. So I'm not an expert in ornamentals or flowers. I grow some native vegetables sometimes, but mostly it will be sticking to kind of the more typical veggies that people are wanting to grow in their veggie patches at the moment. And there's hundreds of ways to do this. So I'm going to show you the way that works for me. And I would really love to know how other people do it, particularly if it's different, in the chat window. So do feel free to put your own tips and comments and talk about different ways that you might do things as well, because that leads to a much richer session for all of us. I will just mention my experience comes from running a productive permaculture garden that is producing most of the fresh food for my household year round. And I have some training, but I also just do a lot of experimenting and hands-on learning at home. So I'm going to show you the technique that I've developed to run this garden. And I'm going to actually talk a lot about how to get away from having to buy things in order to raise your seedlings, and how to do things with less single-use plastic and needing to buy in products. So that's my bias, and that's also part of what I'd like to share with you this evening. So I hope that sounds good, and we'll jump in. Okay, just quickly, here's the overview for things we'll cover tonight and the order that we'll cover them in case you want to skip ahead in the recording if you're watching in the future. We're going to talk about selecting your seeds, a rule of thumb, very literal rule of thumb, whether you sow direct or sow in punnets, how to make your own DIY seed raising mix to save money and also reduce plastic, how you sow seeds, a couple of different methods, how to care for those seedlings, which I think really is the crux of it if you want to have success. Also some troubleshooting and tips, and then we'll finish up with a bit of a general discussion on what to plant right now in Melbourne. All right, so the first thing we want to do when we're growing things from seed is make sure that we are starting with the strongest, freshest seeds that we can possibly find. And to illustrate the difference, I've got this photo in front of you, which is some rattlesnake beans that I grew and saved seed from in my garden last year. And I've graded these, and hopefully you can quite clearly see there's a big difference between the seeds on the left that are looking a little bit small and shriveled, and the really plump, fat, large, healthy seeds on the right. So the size of the seed equals the size of the seedling that you're going to get popping up. And instantly, we just know instinctively that starting from these larger seeds is going to result in stronger seedlings. So please do this if you've got seeds that you can easily handle and you've got your own seed. Hopefully, if you're buying commercial seeds, they will have gone through some grading, but not always. So it's good to just be aware of this when you're looking at seed. The other thing I need to say is that seeds are, although they look like they're dead, they are very much alive, and they do have expiry dates. And that should be on any packet that you buy commercially, or you can ask a gardener that you got them from when they saved that seed and look up how long that seed will stay nice and fresh for. I'm going to show you some pictures later on of what happens if you sow really weak seed, and how you can recognize that you might have weak seed even if you've got a packet of seed that's from a shop, because unfortunately they don't always store seeds very well in shops. Not all shops that sell seeds have gardening literacy, and they may be selling seed that hasn't been properly stored and that might not be at its full strength. So it's a really good one to watch out for. And of course, the best guarantee that you can have is saving your own seed. And if that's not something that you're doing already, have a look through the My Smart Garden program website, and you'll find other sessions like this one on storing your own seed and saving it at home. Next up, we have the rule of thumb. So no doubt lots of you know this one already. But if you're starting to garden, this is the rule of thumb that you need for sowing seeds. We need to sow little seeds close to the surface and larger seeds a little bit deeper down. And that's because each seed is a baby plant asleep with its lunch, as they were once described to me. And this packed lunch that every seed has is just enough strength for that seed to put down some roots and push up some leaves. And then those leaves become solar panels that open to the sun. And from that point, they are able to sustain themselves. But if we bury a little seed too deeply, it just doesn't have enough strength to make it up through the soil surface and start gathering its own energy from the sun. So keep this in mind. Most seeds need to be covered and be a little bit dark, but occasionally there'll be a seed that needs a bit of light to germinate as well. It needs to be very, very close to the surface. And that's usually with the smaller seeds. So just looking at a seed can tell you quite a lot about how you're going to plant it. And the rule of thumb is that we'll sow it about twice as deep as its width. And don't get out a measuring ruler or anything like that. Just have a look at it and roughly gauge twice and then push it in that much. Okay, now we have a choice when we're growing from seed, whether we want to sow it directly in the ground, and that could also mean in a pot if that's your final growing place, or whether to sow it in a punnet, which is a little plastic, usually a plastic pot that we'll keep and look after separately and then later plant out. And there are lots of reasons why we might do one or the other. One of the main reasons we'll plant these seeds directly in the ground is if they are, for example, quite large seeds. They're a bit more robust and likely to survive out there in the wilderness of your garden bed or your balcony full of pots. And so these could be things like, for example, beans or peas, so quite large seeds, especially broad beans. We might also have some seeds which have really delicate tap roots. Now, a carrot is a great example of that. A taproot, think of that carrot shape as a really long, straight root that we don't want twisted and mangled up. So it's incredibly hard to get a nice straight carrot if you have to rip them apart in a seedling punnet and then transplant them. I'm not going to say it can't be done, but it's just unlikely, especially for a beginner. So things like carrots should always be planted from seed directly if you want to guarantee you'll have a good crop. So keep that in mind. I've also personally found radishes to be very reliable sowing direct, and also mustard and things that have that peppery chemical in them that we can sort of smell and taste. They're not as popular with all the pests out there in the garden, and so they seem to have a bit of their own natural defense as well. So that's the reason why we might sow direct. And what I'm going to do now is show you a couple of videos, and unfortunately I have to swap out of PowerPoint to do that because my videos embedded aren't working. Sarah, if this doesn't work, just let me know so I can fix it. I'm now going to show you a video of planting some really large seeds, pea seeds, directly in the ground. Okay, so pretty straightforward there. Sorry, the camera's not very well centered, but with large seeds, just saw me poking them in roughly twice their depth. And then I'll just pinch the soil, push it down a little bit, and definitely make sure you follow up with that water. The seeds need to drink that up to start germinating. Okay, I'm going to stop that share and I will jump into another one for you, which is where I am planting some smaller seeds directly in the ground. And it looks like, sorry, I actually have to close that P video before it will let me play. QuickTime's been very inconvenient lately. Okay, so planting coriander. Once again, Sarah, let me know if that's not showing up. Okay, so the steps are really the same there, just at a much shallower depth for those smaller seeds. And as I put them in, you can see I've just made a very, very shallow depression with my trowel that is roughly double the size of the seed. And when I put them in, I'm spacing them a little bit closer together than I want the final plants so that I can still have a full row if they don't all germinate or if some get eaten by pests. And of course, I can always thin them. And that means just pulling out ones I don't want to make them a little bit further apart if I need to once they grow. And again, always following up with water. And in fact, we'll have to keep this ground moist until they germinate. And even, of course, after that, you'll have to keep watering as well. And that's one of the key disadvantages if you're sowing in the ground. So you'll actually just have to keep often quite a large area moist consistently so that those seeds will germinate properly. So those are the steps for sowing direct. And Natasha has asked, for peas and beans, do you usually water while waiting for them to germinate or only water when first sown? And that's a great question, actually, because a lot of people will say you water them once and then not again until they germinate. And the reasoning behind that is that peas and beans, if they're not germinating, they could actually be rotting in the ground. And of course, being waterlogged and having lots of moisture around can help the fungi that would start to rot them. But for me, it really depends on the soil moisture that you've got and also how warm your weather is going to be. So if there's a risk of them drying out, then I certainly will water them. But if the soil has got good moisture, then there probably isn't much need to until they have used up some of it or it's dried out. For soil moisture, by the way, it's just a simple check with your finger, poke it into the ground and see if it feels like a damp kitchen sponge. And that should be plenty of moisture for most seeds to do well. Okay, so now we'll move on and I will show you some of these steps in more detail, but I want to contrast this with sowing in punnets. And these are some examples of punnets that are commonly used in nurseries. And of course, please don't go out and buy new punnets. Most good nurseries have got pot recycling bins now, and they're very happy for you to rummage around in them until you find the type of pots that you want. I am a particular fan of these ones here. I hope you can see my mouse, I'm circling it. I really like these ones because they're a little bit deeper. And so they allow the roots to have better development before you put the plants in the ground where you want to grow them. This photograph on the right-hand side is a lettuce seedling that has only just put 2 of its leaves out. And look how long that root is already. So I do actually tend to grow small leafy greens in these shallow pots like the one on the left. But just imagine trying to grow something like a zucchini that's going to be quite a big plant and quite a big seedling. Imagine cramming all those roots into a small punnet like this one and potentially having multiple zucchinis in the one punnet. You can do it, but just imagine how much happier that zucchini is going to be if it's got a large pot to develop. And so to that end, I'll actually normally, for a large plant like a zucchini or a cucumber, I'll usually put 3 seeds, as you can see in this photograph in the red punnet, 3 seeds into a punnet of that size, and then potentially thin them out to just 1, so that I've got a single plant going in from that punnet into the ground. And this is, of course, in a small home garden. I'm not suggesting market gardeners would want to do it this way, but for a small home garden, this is, I think, a good scale. It works really well for me. Now, the other advantages of sowing in punnets are that you've got more flexibility with controlling the temperature. And also, if you do it well, you should have a lot more control over pests. So I do, as I refer to the garden out there, it's the Wild West. There's all kinds of stuff happening out there. There'll be pests you've got no idea about. Could be a lot of them. They're all coming for your baby seedlings. It can get very, very cold at night, especially at this time of year. But with punnets, we can take things indoors to keep them warm, or we can put them in a greenhouse, and we can make sure that they're in a clear area where pests are less likely to find them, especially crawling pests. So sowing in punnets is great for that reason. And the other main reason that I do it is that it means you can have crops stacked together in time. You can have some crops growing out still in your beds, and you can have the next crop coming up in punnets, and they will overlap, so you don't have to clear things out of bed so quickly. And it really does make the most of a small garden space if you do that. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is, what do you fill those punnets with? And this is a source of great debate. And I've got lots of feedback from home gardeners over the years with what people are using and their results. And what I can say is that if you use sandy soil, or you use some kind of potting mix or commercial seed raising mix, those sorts of substrates give you a very fine texture. So the seeds are kind of easy to find in there, and they'll give you drainage. And drainage is really important because we don't want our seeds rotting. We do need a nice mix of moisture and air circulating in there as well. However, there's a big but here, because what happens is these substrates dry out really fast. And often people say to me that they don't have success when they use these. Home gardeners struggle with them. And the other reason they have trouble with them is that these typically don't have many nutrients, because it's assumed that as soon as your seedlings germinate, you'll be starting to give them things like liquid fertilizers. And in reality, for home gardeners, not a lot of us do that. And so we often have quite disappointing results. So to my mind, a commercial seed raising mix is kind of ideally suited to commercial greenhouses, maybe not always suited to home gardeners. So what I've been doing and what I recommend for people starting to raise veggie seedlings is to add something like compost or worm castings. And these materials will provide those nutrients that are missing. And they're also like a sponge that holds water in the punnets, which can be so helpful. But of course, I know a lot of you will be thinking, yes, they can have weed seeds and they can also have pests in them as well. So you've got to make up your own mind here about which you want to preference and prioritise. I am personally using a mix of about 1 part compost or worm castings to about 3 parts of either sandy soil or some kind of seed raising mix or potting mix. A lot of horticulturalists, I should acknowledge, will say it's a big no-no to use soil for raising seeds. I often try things out just to see how bad it is and see if it actually works or not. And it turns out that as I imagined, if you can plant a seed directly in your veggie patch soil, you can also put some of that veggie patch soil in a punnet and plant seeds into it. And most of the time that will be successful. The only but in there is if you've got a really, really heavy clay or just a very poor garden soil that hasn't had a lot of improvement over years of gardening. And in those cases, you may decide to use some seed raising or potting mix. You could also, for a very clay soil, add some sand to that for better drainage before using it for seeds. But I do think it's well worth experimenting and persisting here, because you'll save yourself an awful lot of money over the years if you can just use your own soil for raising seeds rather than needing to buy commercial seed raising or potting mixes. So do feel free to use those products. Feel free to mix in compost or worm castings or not. Feel free to experiment and see whether you have success using your own veggie patch soil. But I will put a caution in here that if you're using your own soil or compost, then yes, you could have pests in there. So you need to look out for those, especially at night for the first week or so. And also you'll need to learn and remove weed seedlings because they will also come up and you don't want to accidentally grow weeds instead of vegetables. I'll show you an example later on. Catherine's just popped in a very timely question. What do you think about peach or coir, coconut coir for seed raising? Now they're often included as an ingredient in DIY seed raising mixes. I actually, to be honest, have not personally used either of them because I had so much success just using my own soil, and for me, really, why complicate things if you don't need to? But I know definitely people make up seed raising mixes with coconut coir. It has come from a long way away for us down here in Melbourne, so that's something to consider. Peach is traditionally used in seed raising mixes, comes from very, very unsustainable sources, so I'm not going to encourage that at all. But you will read a lot about mixing peat in old gardening books, for example. So I hope that helps, Catherine. All right, the next one we'll do is sowing seeds in punnets. So once again, sorry about this, I'm going to jump out of there and jump into my QuickTime video, which is going to come up hopefully now. So I'll show you a video of how I plant in punnets. Okay, I'm going to rewind and just walk through that step by step, pointing a few things out. Firstly, I think this is a bit of a mix of soil and maybe some old seed raising mix from some seedlings I might have bought. It's a bit of a mix, and I do tend to save and reuse those substrates if I do find them coming into my garden. Firstly, I'm firming down the soil here. You can definitely just use your fingers. The other more sophisticated way that I'm showing you now is with a piece of wood. You can also just use a full punnet pressed onto another punnet. Here I'm making holes for the seeds, and I know some people just sprinkle the seeds on the surface, and that's another way of doing it. It's totally fine. I do though like to make deliberate holes partly to control the depth, which we've talked about is quite important, as we said earlier, but also because if you separate the seedlings now, it means that they won't be all crushed up against each other and hard to separate when it comes time to actually planting them out. So I find it quite helpful, but if you want to skip this step, feel free. And once again, just note I've done them about twice as deep as the seed that I'm putting in, which in this case is a frilly red lettuce. Now, what I'm doing here with my fingers is just twisting the finger and thumb together until seeds drop out. And I'm aiming for about 2 to 3 seeds in each hole. Might have missed on the first one, but never mind. And that 2 to 3 seeds in each hole is just to cover and make sure that I've got at least one that comes up. And I will actually be thinning those later on in most cases. So we'll end up with one plant in each hole. In this case, you can either pinch them together as I've done on the left-hand side, or if you've got a lot and you want to, you can sprinkle over some extra mix on top to cover them like I'm doing on the right-hand side. Firming them down is important just to give good contact with the mix, and that will help them stay nice and moist. And don't forget to label them. And I absolutely love Venetian blinds. If you can find an old Venetian blind and cut up the strips of it, it is the perfect size to fit into these commercial seed raising punnets. And you can write on it with a permanent marker, as you see there, and you can write on them top and bottom, back and front. And by the time you've done that, usually over, say, 4 years, you are back to the start and they've faded. So they pretty much last forever. So very happy with those, and never let a Venetian blind get away. And thanks to my friend Beck for that wonderful tip. And then the very last step here is, of course, to water them. And I'll show you what I'm watering them with in a minute. So I hope that was helpful. Again, please let me know if you've got another way of doing it and some of your own tips and tricks in the chat window. That's very helpful. Annalise is saying, I've been using old takeaway coffee cups to grow my seeds, as I found I had collected more because of COVID. That's an awesome way of upcycling them, Annalise. And Helen's using yogurt containers as well. So really great options here for reusing materials that might otherwise go to waste. Okay, so just to reiterate and add a few things to those tips. If you've got seeds that are really small, not always, but smaller seeds often don't have as high success on an individual seed basis. So usually I will sow a few extra if they're very small seeds to make sure that I get a full punnet. Also, if you know the seeds are getting a bit old, or perhaps they haven't been stored very well, they might have been stored somewhere a bit too hot, for example, and they might not germinate well. So if you know that you've not got top quality seed, then I tend to sow a little bit more. And I know I was talking about expiry dates at the beginning. If you've got seed that's expired, it doesn't mean you can't use it, but usually I'll start to sow more and more and more once they're past the expiry, until I get to a point where I'll just dump the whole lot in and see if anything comes up, and maybe it will, maybe it won't. So just a little tip there. Sharon's also pointing out, or maybe it's a question, egg cartons. I know people do successfully raise seeds in egg cartons. You want to make sure that, because they're very shallow, you want to make sure that they can actually get out of the egg carton and into the soil. So in other words, that they're not trapped in there while they're waiting for the cardboard to break down. So just check that and maybe poke a hole in the bottom of each one or something to help get them through. Oh, Helen is just correcting that. So she actually uses yogurt containers cut into strips to make labels. That's a great idea as well. So thank you, Helen, for that. Buzz is asking, how do you store leftover seeds? Great question, because you will usually have leftover seeds. And the golden rules are keeping them cool, dark, and dry. So seeds really prefer to have nice, cool, stable temperatures, and definitely keep them out of any sun, because sun hitting a seed packet can make the temperature fluctuate quite dramatically in there. So in other words, Buzz, don't put them in a greenhouse, and probably don't put them in a garden shed, two very popular locations, unfortunately. Try and keep them somewhere indoors in a really stable temperature part of your house. And Sarah's saying she cuts up milk cartons for labels and they last as long as the seedling grows. Great, Sarah. Mary Jane thanking Helen for the tip on yogurt containers. Wonderful. So it's great to have some of that discussion going on in the chat. All right, so we'll hone in now on some of the most important parts of sowing seeds and a few tips for looking after them while they're growing. And firstly, I know this is a little bit obvious, but you really have to keep them moist at all times for just about every seed I can think of. And if a seed starts to germinate but then dries out, it can't recover from that. So you've got one chance and you've really got to keep them moist throughout the whole process. And of course, they're quite fragile, especially when they're in that early phase. So keep them moist at all times. And my very favorite tool for doing that is actually it's a 1 litre water bottle that I picked up from out on the street somewhere. So I picked up some trash. And I've made some holes in the lid, as you can see here, just by holding a needle over a flame, a candle, and then poking it in a few times. And what I love about this, besides the fact that it would otherwise have just been out there and washing into waterways, is that it's nice and gentle, because you don't want to undo all the work that you did positioning those seeds by blasting them out with a stream of water that's too strong. And I used to actually have one of those pump spray packs, but I've come back to thinking that it's actually quite excessive for a garden of my size, because I can water everything in less than 30 seconds with one of these water bottles. So for me, this is the right scale. But of course, there are other systems out there if you want to grow a lot more seedlings than I do. I might come back to some of those comments in the chat, because they're actually all about storing seeds. So if it's okay, we might come back to them at the end and we can get on to storing seeds there. Right, next, this is what you can expect to see just after they've germinated, and also when we're just poking their little seed heads up here. And in the bottom right corner, you can see there, if you're looking closely, you can see they're just starting to lean to the right-hand side. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, but it's good to notice things like that when your seeds come up, because it might mean you need to make some adjustments. And we'll leave that little cliffhanger there. We'll come back to it. Next, again, I'm re-emphasizing this because it's just so important. This is the difference with seed that is fresh and seed that is not fresh and is weak. And so you'll see this straight away when they germinate, or perhaps when they don't germinate in some cases. And I mention this because if you're starting to grow food and you haven't had much experience, sometimes you'll think, oh, I'm not very good at growing basil from seed, when the truth is you actually just unfortunately didn't have very strong basil seed to begin with. So I just want you to see this difference here. And seed that is strong will literally almost burst out of the punnet. It'll germinate very quickly, very evenly. You have these really, really healthy looking large seedlings quite quickly. So just keep an eye out for that, and don't always assume that it's something that you've done wrong. So unfortunately, you can get seeds supplied commercially that are not in good shape. Susie will come back to that. Why do I get leggy seedlings? Promise, we'll come back to it. I'm going to talk just a bit now about tips for caring for these seedlings. And I will say, first of all, here that most seeds, there are some exceptions, most seeds don't need any light to germinate. So that's great, because it means we can actually keep them indoors where they're not getting a lot of sunlight until they've germinated, and they can take advantage of nice warm indoor temperatures. So actually don't recommend putting your seedlings this close, but this is where I'm germinating tomato seeds in winter in Melbourne in a room, and you don't, obviously most people won't have a little slow combustion heater, but just any kind of heated indoor space will be excellent for germinating seeds. You're actually using your home like a greenhouse, if you like. But, and here's the but, once the seedlings have germinated, then they need extremely bright light for a normal number of daylight hours. So while you can germinate them inside and you can keep them inside at night to keep nice and cozy, you do need to take them out in the daylight and put them somewhere that's really, really bright for them to grow properly. And Susie, that actually relates to your point of why do I get leggy seedlings? It is because they're not getting quite enough sunlight. And I'm going to show you a picture of that coming up as well. So if your seedlings start to lean and if they start to develop quite long leggy stems, then that's a really, really good sign that they've got to be somewhere brighter. People often have that problem if they're growing them indoors or if they're growing them in a position where they're only getting part sun for a couple of hours a day. So on the right hand side, this is my little seed raising setup. You don't need anything like this, but I had a lot of fun converting a barbecue that was headed for landfill in hard rubbish into a very beautiful ergonomic seed raising bench. I got an angle grinder and I cut some sort of squares out of the top, and it's got some plastic on there. You could use any kind of thick plastic that you come across in landfill or in the rubbish, and that's actually held on with magnets so that I can take it off and swap it for shade cloth if I want to do seed raising, which I do in summer, and where you need a little bit more protection from the sun. This tray here is a piece of supermarket shelf that was also headed for landfill. And it's just perfect actually, and I really, really love the size of it for what I do. It's really good scale for a small home garden. So yeah, anything like this that you can cobble together, you know, even having just a bit of plastic draped over your seedlings when they're sitting out in the sun will help at this time of year to speed up their growth. So you don't need to build yourself a big greenhouse, especially if you've only got a couple of veggie beds. Just things on a very, very small scale will probably be enough. Mary Jane says it's a good idea for an unused barbecue just sitting in the garage. Oh, great. Good. Okay. So I was talking about tomato seeds before, and I thought I'd show you, because at this time of year, this is the only thing that is currently being grown at my place. And this photograph on the left-hand side, if I highlight one with my mouse, this is a tomato seed just germinating here. And there's another one here, and there's more in here. So that's what they look like. But before they germinated, we got weed seeds popping up. Usually the weed seeds will beat almost anything that you deliberately plant. And just highlighting here again that if you are using some of your own soil, this is the thing that you'll need to look out for. And I promise you very quickly you'll learn what weed seeds look like and learn the types of weeds that you're getting. And you can just pull these out or pinch them off. But the other reason to put your veggie seeds in a very deliberate pattern is it is quite obvious once they've germinated which ones are your target vegetables and which ones are the cheeky weed seeds that are trying to sneak in. So that's a tip for beginners there. This photograph here is my tomato seedlings, and that is today, the little patch of sunshine that we did get today. And so yeah, for people who might be thinking, wow, it's quite early to have tomato seeds, you can do it. And you can start them from mid to late July in Melbourne, as long as you're starting them somewhere indoors to germinate and then taking them outside or having them in a greenhouse and then maybe bringing them back in at night if they're not in a greenhouse. So you can do it, and you will end up with at least an extra month of tomatoes if you're growing the indeterminate types of tomatoes that just keep cropping. That's as opposed to determinate tomatoes where they will crop all at once and then the crop is over. So indeterminate types, like lots of your heirlooms and lots of cherry tomatoes, you will get an extra month of tomatoes if you can start them earlier. And I will be just, for comparison, I'm in Northcote and I'm planting them in raised vegetable beds, which warm up a little bit faster than the ground. And I will be planting them in the first week of September in my microclimate. If you've got lots of frost where you live, then this won't work for you, but we are relatively frost free where I am, and so I get away with it. And I could also cover them on a very cold night with some sort of netting that would also help to ward off any frost that was due. Eleanor's asked, if I bring my seedlings outside during the day, it can still be quite cold. Will this negatively impact the seedlings? Not thinking frosty mornings, just cold. Yeah, it can, Eleanor, but honestly, when the sun is out like this and it's hitting that black soil, it does warm up, I think, the soil quite a lot. So I don't worry too much about a crisp day, but the brightness in the sun is what those seedlings are after. And I'm finding this works really well for me. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you on this slide is that you'll see here I've got 4 tomato seedlings generally in each punnet, but I sowed 2 or 3 in each hole, the same as those lettuce seeds that I showed you as well. So what has happened here is I've actually thinned out to the strongest seedling in each hole just by pulling them out. So now I've only got the nicest, strongest, toughest little tomatoes growing. And as these develop, some of them might have an accident, and some of them will grow quicker than others. And I will eventually thin them out to just 1 tomato growing in each punnet. And that 1 tomato will be a superstar, which is really what you want in small gardens where you've got to make the most of every space you've got. Next up, we'll go through some other tips in caring for the seedlings. And probably one of the best tips that I can offer is make sure you put your seedlings somewhere that you'll see them without having to make extra effort. And for contrast here, I've got some brassica seedlings, some kale seedlings, and I've got some that were in my barbecue seed raising bench that were close to the back door where I pass them all the time. And I got some others that I just tucked away down the garden and forgot about. And yeah, it's a lot harder to keep an eye on seedlings if they're not in your face all the time. And the cabbage white butterfly caterpillars absolutely destroyed these seedlings. And I was really sad, but then I realized, of course, I didn't take my own advice, and there you go. So I do strongly recommend that you find somewhere that you will pass a couple of times a day without having to even think about it, and you will notice if there's a problem that you need to deal with, and you will remember to water them a lot more easily. So yeah, look for things that are really close to your back door, or maybe your front door if that's where you go in and out. And of course, we need to protect them from pests. And I would always encourage you to check at night, because nighttime is when a lot of our common vegetable pests are active, and that's when you'll see them starting to crawl all over your seedlings. Sharon's just offering a tip here. She snips out the seedlings she doesn't want so that she doesn't damage the roots by pulling on them. So yeah, not damaging the roots of the other seedlings. So yeah, that's a great tip from Sharon. You can definitely do that as well. Annalise, I'll come to that question. I will. The other tip is that we do get extreme heat waves in Melbourne, of course, and it's not so much a challenge now, but it can, of course, be a real problem if you're trying to start seeds in the middle of summer to have winter crops, for example. So the way that I've been dealing with that is by having my seedling punnets in a solid tray that holds water. And during a heat wave, I'll put at least a centimetre, maybe even an inch of water in the bottom, as you might be able to see on the right-hand side here. And that is like a mini wicking bed for your seedlings. And it works really well once the seeds have germinated for keeping them moist during a heat wave. I will also sometimes throw an old sheet over them just to take the worst of the sun off, and so they don't get scalded. And together with those 2 tricks, I can get through most of the summer seed raising period without issue. But yeah, it can be a bit of a tricky balance, trying to get enough sunlight for good growth, but also warding off the worst of that heat in months like January and February. Now, Annalise, how big do you let your tomato seedlings get before you plant them in the garden beds? Well, there's probably quite a few answers to this one, but the rule of thumb I have for myself is that when the seedlings are about the same height as the punnet that I've planted them in, that's my guide for getting them into the beds. You will see tomatoes in nurseries that are 3 times that height and being sold for sale. And in many vegetables, you won't get away with that. In tomatoes, though, you actually will, because they have this incredible ability to recover, and they will actually form roots all the way up their stem, which is quite unusual for many vegetables. So you can actually bury them, as I've got in the photograph on the right, you can bury them really deeply, right up to the first or even second set of leaves, and they will form roots all the way up, and they will regreen if they're looking a bit tired and yellow, and grow into quite a strong and healthy plant. So tomatoes in that sense are reasonably unique, but for most vegetable seedlings, you really do want to get them in once they start getting to the height of that punnet, or they will start exhausting the food supplies and they'll get weak and they may not make a recovery into strong, healthy adult plants. So that's my rule of thumb. And I'll show you what some seedlings look like if they go past that point as well. It is interesting to note that if you plant some of your seedlings and not others, the ones that you plant will keep growing and expanding, but the ones that you don't plant will reach a ceiling where they will just stop growing and they will become stunted, and they'll just sort of peak out and not grow any further. So my aim is always to just keep them growing steadily and not experience that pause, that you've got a window of time where you can pause their growth and then get away with it. But yeah, if you leave that too long, then they won't be good anymore. And I'm being a bit vague here. So to be a bit more specific, you've got somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks of growing in a punnet after the seeds have germinated. And after that point, they really do have to go into a larger pot or into the ground in a bed. All right, we're going to go through some troubleshooting now, and this is a great time for some audience participation in the chat window. So I'm going to show you some pictures, and I'd like you to tell me what has gone wrong, starting with an array of carrots in punnets in a nursery. So what has gone wrong here? I'm going to leave a pause and trust that a few people are typing away on the keyboards. I've got a tentative reply, not enough sun. No, I'm not going to say that. Not thinned out, that is definitely true. Have a look at those seedlings there and how close together they are. There's something else going on here as well. Helen says too many seedlings in a punnet, same as Angelique. Annette has gone to the one I wanted to mention, which is that they should have been direct sown for success. So yeah, even though they've got them on sale, I know it's outrageous that they can sell them, but you really, really will struggle to get a good carrot from carrot seedlings. So yeah, unfortunately, you can't always trust what's on the shelf at a nursery, even a good nursery. I know some good nurseries that still sell them, but they also have signs saying that we recommend you grow them from seed. Okay, what is going on in the second picture here? What is happening to these little babies? Yes, Annalisa's got it. Not enough sunlight. You've all got it. Not enough. A leader has said not turned regularly, and that's interesting because yes, if you notice your seedlings are leaning, you can actually swivel the punnet around so that they try and lean in the opposite direction. I do sometimes do that, but it's not a complete substitute for just the fundamental lack of light. And I'm showing you this photo in particular because these are very leggy. If your seedlings get to this point, I can't guarantee that they are actually going to make it. This can be kind of a terminal condition for seeds. So that's why back earlier when I showed you those lettuce seeds that have just germinated and they were just starting to get a little lean on them, that's the stage where you want to intervene, not when they get to this stage. And yeah, lots of comments in there. That's great. Okay, last one I've got for you. What is going on here? These are tomatoes in punnets, by the way. Okay, Jade said too much water. That's possible, Jade. I don't actually think that's what's going on here, but you will start to get symptoms in plants that have been waterlogged and had soaked roots. We've got also people saying they're dry, and that also could be true, but not what I'm wanting to focus on. Mary Jane said they're too late for replanting. I agree with you there, although like I said, you probably get away with it for tomatoes just because they can regenerate themselves so well. And so I would have planted them out by now. And Karen has got it, what I wanted to talk about, not the right nutrients or not enough nutrients in there. And that also relates to needing to be transplanted because they've just used up everything that little punnet has got. And Shuab is also kind of correct that the soil is poor. It might have started out with enough nutrients, but it doesn't have them anymore. And Jerry also correct, not enough fertilizer. So what I'm actually picking up on here is that, I know it may not be the easiest photo to see, but what I can see here is the oldest leaves are turning yellow. And the oldest leaves turning yellow is an indicator that the nitrogen in the soil is depleted because they are pulling it out of their older leaves and redirecting it to the younger leaves so that they continue growing. The other indicator of nitrogen deficiency is stunted growth. So we would start to see them stop growing if we were watching them carefully. So yeah, I show you this one because it's so common and it's an indicator of all other nutrients also becoming less available. And it shows up when seedlings have just been in the punnets for far too long because they're getting everything that they need from that punnet. And it's a very, very limited pantry, if you like, for a plant to draw from. So do look out for that in nurseries, and in that way you'll know which seeds have been in there too long and which need to be planted. Karen's asking, is it too late for these or can you add fertilizer to help them out? Yeah, you definitely can. And if the bed wasn't ready for my seedlings, then I would add, what would I add? I would actually get some poultry manure from my quail aviary and I would just mix that into a wheat tea with some water and I'd use that to irrigate them. People will use things like sea salt and worm castings and things. They are less of a nutrient source and more of a micronutrient source. So that we've got lots of great trace elements, lots of microbiology, but they may not actually be enough to help overcome this condition. And the other thing that you could do is just sprinkle a little bit of compost or tiny bit of like a tiny pinch of blood and bone or another organic fertilizer on the surface just to keep them going a little bit longer. All those things would work as well. Oh gosh, flurry of questions in here. Eleanor's asked, I plan to use liquid fertilizer for my seedlings to help with nutrients. When do I start feeding and how often? Oh, it's a difficult question, Eleanor, because it depends on so many things. If you've got compost or worm castings mixed into your potting mix, you won't have this problem. I'm quite sure of that. So it's not a problem that I actually come across, but it will happen if you're using a straight commercial seed raising mix, for example. So in that case, I would probably be feeding them very early, as soon as the seed leaves, the first leaves start coming up. And I mean, it's hard to say how often because I don't know what you're using and I don't know how strong it is, but I would be observing their growth, and if they start to look yellow and they're not growing strongly, then it would be time for some more. Chris is asking what ratio of poultry manure to water I would use. It's another great question, Chris. I'd just chuck maybe a handful in a watering can and shake it around and see if it did the trick, and I would do that again in a day or two if it looked like they weren't responding and needed more. I know it's maddeningly imprecise, but honestly, it won't take much just to get them over that hurdle because they're still quite small. Neil said, Kat, I sowed some seeds today and now I realise after seeing the video that I didn't give enough depth of seed raising mix, just around 5 centimetres. Did I waste the seeds, or is there anything I can do now, or should I add more seedling mix to add depth as soon as they germinate? Oh, it's a lot in there, Neil. That's great. Really, really interesting question. So no, just continue with them however they are. I don't know what seeds you've sowed exactly, but I gather they're going to be some sort of larger vegetable because I will do small leafy greens in those 5 centimetre punnets. So they're not wasted. What you can do is just wait till they've grown for a couple of weeks and then very, very gently transplant them, or we sometimes say prick them out into larger pots. And there's lots of gardeners that do sometimes multiple rounds of pricking seedlings out, moving from smaller containers to gradually larger ones. And sometimes that's important if you've got a really, really big garden and limited seed raising space. I find for the scale that I'm working on, that's just too many extra steps. So I raise them in punnets once and then they go straight into the ground. But you could just absolutely adopt that. Just wait until they're big enough for you to handle them without damaging them. And then you can upsize them into another pot if you want to as well. I would not, though, add more seed raising mix, because in most vegetables, you don't want to bury the stem because they'll start to rot. There are exceptions to that, like silver beet and the brassica family, so kale and cabbage, and also tomatoes. You could add more depth to them without damage, but generally speaking, you won't do that because you'll just end up with stems rotting. Okay, oh, lots and lots of questions here. Weed tea, Sharon's asked, I think you're asking about replacing, using that as a fertilizer, and yes, absolutely, Sharon, that will also work well. Oh, yes. Buzz has asked, when planting very small seedlings or seeds, I think, it's difficult to pick up 1 to 3 to put in each hole. Do you have a tool or a way to do this? Yeah, so I'm just using my thumb and my finger moved around, like pinching and then wiggling it a little bit. I know that won't work for everyone. I'm so glad you asked, Buzz. The best trick I've seen that most of you will have at home is using a skewer or a chopstick and actually just dipping the tip in some water and then using that to dip in the seeds to pick them up. A lot of people have great success with that. And they also sell seed sowing tools where you can adjust the opening on it and then seeds will come out in a controlled way. So I know you can get those, but I do actually like the chopstick method as well. Sarania has asked, does keeping the punnets near the windowsill affect the germination due to cold nights? Possibly. It depends how insulated that window is, and there'd be a big difference between a double glazed window and a single glazed. And if it was single glazed and a really chilly night, then maybe I'd move it to maybe a dining table, or at least somewhere that's away from the window and a little bit more cozy. And oh, so many tips in here. Julie's saying you can use toilet paper as seed tape. That's another fantastic tip. So what Julie's talking about there is you can actually position your seeds along a piece of paper using sometimes, tell us what you use, Julie. Some people use like a flour and water paste, but you have to be very careful not to germinate the seed. But you can position the seeds along the paper and then plant the paper so that they're all evenly spaced in the right proportions. So yeah, Julie, tell us more in the chat window about how you make seed tape. That'd be great. Buzz also pointing out that you can use toilet paper rolls as punnets. It's a fabulous tip. All right, I've got a couple more tips for you left. I'm just noticing the time has gone as well, so we have to speed up a little bit. So quickly, just for people who are wanting to do carrots in the beds, I have best success with them if I actually put an old woolen blanket over the top just when I've planted them. And what the blanket does is it keeps the surface of the bed nice and even in temperature and in moisture as well. And it just really, really helps a very small, fine seed to germinate evenly. And the photo that you can see, it's not the nicest photo, but what you're seeing is me removing that blanket, and the carrot seeds have all started to germinate, and they haven't photosynthesized yet, which is why they're yellow, the leaves are yellow. But this is the stage you need to pull it off. So you just keep checking it until you see them at this stage, and then the blanket can come off. And after that, carrots are reasonably easy to grow. But because they're so fine and you have to plant them close to the surface, it can be really difficult to get them up without a blanket. All right, coming right to the end of what I wanted to share with you. The question is, what can I plant right now? And obviously that is coming into a very, very long list with spring. So my favourite website to refer people to is Gardening Australia, and they have a temperate planting guide, and you can check that out at your own pace and see what's coming up. I have already planted tomato seeds in a warm microclimate, as I said, and they're being taken outdoors every day for their sun bath. And this weekend, I'll be putting in some of the cold tolerant crops that I want to grow in spring, which is going to include things like celery and silver beet, for example. The ones to wait a lot longer for in Melbourne, in my experience, are things like capsicum and chili and basil and eggplant. And I won't be putting those in until probably October because they really need good warm soil. And so in between tomatoes and those ones, most of your common spring crops will be coming up in the next month. So I really hope this workshop has helped you to have a bit more confidence in how you're going to sow them. So what I'm going to do is finish officially because we're at time, and then I will stay for as many of these questions as you have left. So I just want to thank you for staying with us tonight, and really hope that you'll get out there and start growing or keep growing and have some more success as a result of these tips. And My Smart Garden, the program that this is a part of, has a huge array of free events coming up, but also recordings on our website. So if you're not already part of the program, have a look at www.mysmartgarden.org.au. And we also send out newsletters once a month with lots of seasonal tips and also information about the events that are coming up. I am also going to send you a survey tomorrow to find out how you found this session. And it's extremely important that you fill it in because these programs run on data and we need to know if you're enjoying the sessions or not so that we can change them, make them better, or keep running them if you're enjoying them. And I also just want to take a minute to for Sarah, maybe Michelle, to remind you about the Permaculture Out West event that is coming up, because that'll have lots of great components as well that you can enjoy. So Sarah, any words to share about that, or some reminders of websites?
Yeah, just if you are interested in the western suburbs of Melbourne, you can look up the Pollinate Out West Festival via our website or Facebook from Permaculture Out West. And if you're interested as well in becoming a member, I think you can go to the Permaculture Victoria website and sign up as a member there and choose Permaculture Out West as your local group, or if you're in another part of Melbourne, there are other local groups.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. So we're at the official end now. Apologies for going a couple of minutes over time. I'm going to just kick on here and take any questions that you might have, but I don't know who's left and who hasn't. So apologies, but if you could retype any questions that you might have in the chat now, that would be really great. I'm going to go to one from Carlos earlier. Is it okay to store seeds in the fridge? And the answer is maybe, depending on if you can keep them dry or not. So the cold will be great for them, but many fridges are quite humid and moist, and that moisture can damage seeds and cause them to go moldy. So actually a better option, Carlos, is storing them in the freezer if you've got enough space in there, and make sure they're in some really tightly sealed containers. Things like Ziploc plastic bags, reused preferably, are really good for that. And you'll also want to make sure that they come back up to room temperature before you open that bag. Otherwise, you'll get lots of moisture condensing on the seeds. And again, they can start to germinate or go moldy from that moisture in there before you get them in the ground. So I hope that helps. Catherine was asking, when a seedling or plant is a heavy feeder, what does that mean? It's a very general term that means it uses more nutrients than most other vegetables, for example. So it'll just be drawing a bit more heavily, and it will need a bit more compost, a bit more chook manure, or whatever other organic fertilizer source you've got available to you. It will need a lot more of them to grow to its full potential. Check if there's any other questions, or maybe there aren't more questions. Oh, here we go. Question from iPad. Thanks so much, Kat. I grew pumpkins last year, 2 varieties, and both varieties produced a number of pumpkins of appropriate size, but they were lacking in taste. Is that due to poor soil? Oh, possibly. It's hard to diagnose, to be honest. Usually if they're lacking in taste, it means that they didn't have enough sunshine or they weren't in the ground for long enough. So maybe I'll leave you to think if either of those could have been the problem. It could be poor soil, but usually they can get to size, but whether they develop sweetness and flavour is usually about the sun that they had access to or the length of time they were grown. If seeds are in the freezer, can you freeze, defrost, and then freeze again? Yes, so if that's talking about taking the seeds out and then using some and then putting them back in the freezer, yeah, you'll get away with that. But I do try and minimize the time that they're out of the freezer, so the seeds are still reasonably cold when they go back in. So you basically just don't want to fluctuate them too much, Carlos, if you can help that. Angelique is asking about seed pad heat. So you can buy electric heated pads that you can sit a punnet of seeds on to help germinate them. What do I think of those? I think they're a handy tool. I haven't found it necessary to own one myself, and I tend to use, as I said, the house as a bit of a greenhouse or a heat source to germinate seeds a little bit early. But there might be other contexts where a seed heating pad is more useful. So yeah, I don't mind them. Unfortunately, I can't recommend any brands or anything like that for you, Angelique, because I don't use them. Perhaps other people do and can pop that in the chat. Lynn is asking, when do I start fertilizing seedlings? Yeah, we did actually talk a little bit about that, Lynn. I was saying that I actually don't fertilize them as they're growing. I add compost and worm castings to the seed raising mix, which replaces that kind of ongoing fertilizing that some people do. So look, usually people say things like every 2 weeks, give them some kind of liquid fertilizer. So you could start doing that as soon as they've got their leaves up, and then try it out every 2 weeks. And the indicator would be, are they starting to yellow? Are they not growing as quickly as I expected? That would be my trigger for doing it a bit more regularly. But I prefer to avoid all of that and not guess, just by having that compost in the mix from the beginning. Karen's saying, I read somewhere that I could leave my eggplants in the ground from one summer to another. I've tried that, but they're looking a bit sad, and I'm keen to see if they'll revive in spring. Have you ever tried this? No, Karen, I haven't tried it with eggplants, but I do it regularly with capsicums. So I find capsicums a lot more resilient if they're in a warm, sunny position. If they're still looking well, they're not dead, then you've got a good chance at this time of year. So I'll cross all my fingers for you and hope that they pull through. Oh wow, we're getting into lots of general gardening questions here, so I'm going to try and keep it to the seed raising ones, otherwise we'll be here till 9 o'clock. Sorry, so I'll just have a look for, oh no, I did say I'd answer every question, didn't I? Annalise, my tomato plants last year grew decent tomatoes, but the plants started dying off quite quickly. Is there something I can do to protect them? Again, it's hard to diagnose, Annalise, but most tomato plants that I see in Melbourne have a russet mite or a rust mite problem, and that leads to a very rapid drying off and crisping up of the leaves from the base up, and it's like a wave that moves through the plant and they go really brown and crispy. So if that sounds familiar, I'm just guessing here because there's other reasons why they might die, but if that is the problem, have a look up, and I'm just putting it in the chat window now for you, russet or rust mite, and have a look for the tips. And what I use is wettable sulfur, and I've actually doubled my crop by getting onto that nice and early, but you've got to start it as soon as you first see symptoms, which is around late November for me. It's a long-winded one that's not really on the seed raising topic, so I'm going to keep moving on. Yes, okay. Baz is asking, if you have soil that's completely dried out and fairly lifeless like old pots, is it possible to bring it back to life for planting by adding compost? Yes, absolutely. Sometimes you have to kind of force it to take on water again by just sort of submerging it underwater and waiting for all the bubbles to go and letting it really soak, Buzz. And then add a really, really generous amount of compost, maybe a quarter of the volume of the pot if you can. But yeah, absolutely, you'll bring it back. It just takes a little bit of effort. Shanthi veggies to suit a plot without much sunlight. Leafy greens in a nutshell, and also mustard greens specifically. The red mustard varieties are really, really good in low light, and they have a very peppery flavour. But if you cook that, the heat disappears and you just get the lovely heat without the wasabi nose problem. How much direct sunlight for greens? Oh, look, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 hours a day. Give that a whirl. Natasha, this recording is going to be available hopefully from tomorrow, and I will email it all to you. Oh gosh, we're getting really broad here. So I am just going to skip some of these and stay straight on seeds. What perennial vegetable seeds work well in Melbourne? A lot of perennials actually we grow from parts of the plant rather than from seed, because it takes an awful lot of time if you go from seed. So generally speaking, for example, if you want to grow asparagus, you'll order crowns in winter when they're dormant and plant the root system of the plant. Rhubarb, usually you can just divide it. If you know anyone who's got rhubarb, just dig it up and stick a shovel through it, or a spade rather, and break it into pieces, and you've got multiple rhubarb plants. Yeah, so lots of perennials prefer to grow them from other things besides seeds. Yeah, feel free to pop some suggestions in the chat. People still visiting. I'm just getting a mental blank about perennial veggies. Chris is asking about hydro. Oh, sorry, that's not a seed question, Chris. Come back another time. Do you ever mulch on top of seedlings once you've transplanted them? Or best no cover for more sunlight? This is Catherine. Yeah, so that's a combination. You don't want seedlings to be covered by mulch accidentally, so they need to be large enough to stick their heads above that mulch and not be covered. If at this time of year when it's really cold, the sun hitting the soil can be helpful just to warm it up a little bit more, but this is an anomaly, and almost every other time of year I'm trying to cover that soil with mulch or with leaf cover as quickly as I possibly can to protect the soil. And I usually find it's easier if I can to mulch first and then part the mulch and plant the seedlings, rather than plant the seedlings first and then try and get mulch all around them, as a bit of a tip. So yes is the answer, but at this time of year, perhaps you might want a little bit of clear soil just to absorb that lovely sun. Luz is asking, can I use the Bokashi liquid to fertilize my seedlings? If it's very diluted, you can. And by very diluted, I'd say like only a very, very faint smell, because it's pretty strong stuff. But yeah, be quite careful. I'd say maybe not ideal, Luz. So do some experiments with it, make it very, very weak, and see how you go. Yeah, let me know how you go with it. Okay, should I soak hard seeds and coriander overnight before planting them, please? From Neil. You can, Neil, and some people, especially for larger seeds like beans, will soak them before planting them. You don't have to, but the advantage is that you know that they're going to evenly absorb enough moisture before they are out in the ground. So in other words, if you're not reliable about watering them, or if it's quite a dry time of year, it just overcomes that first hurdle for them getting enough moisture to swell up quickly. So you can do that, but it's not necessary as long as you've got nice consistent soil moisture for them once you've planted them. Oh, getting to the end. Ajam, when you start to take the seeds outdoors for the sunbath, when do you do that? Well, as soon as they've germinated. So as soon as you start to see the first little leaves, then they must have the sun. Otherwise, they'll become very weak and very leggy. So yes, as soon as the seed has opened and leaves have come up. And we've reached the end. And Sarah is talking about warrigal green seeds. That's a wonderful native vegetable that we've got in this part of the world, and they grow well from seed. They're sort of perennial. They sometimes die off and have to be replanted, and often they will regrow from seed that they've dropped on the ground. So yeah, a bit of both, but it's a lovely reminder. Thank you, Sarah. And we're right at the very end now. So I hope that was helpful to you all. Feel free to keep in touch with the program. We're also on Instagram if you want to ask questions and tag us and show us all your seeds. I'd really love that. It's at My Smart Garden, and I'm the one answering all the questions and things on there. So keep in touch with us through that. So yeah, all the very best. We're right at the end, and you'll get an email from me tomorrow. And I will include notes for you on what we've covered, as well as the recording of the session and the survey. So good evening, everyone. And thanks again to Sarah and also Michelle from POW, and good luck with the rest of your events program.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.